Hi, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Love, Marriage, and Jewish Families, Paradoxes of a Social Revolution. My name is Rachel Lieberman. I'm the Assistant Director at JOFA, and I'm very excited to welcome all of you today. Today's webinar is hosted by JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, in partnership with HBI, the Hadassah-Brandeis Institute, and it is the latest installment in JOFA's webinar series, which began about 2 years ago. JOFA advocates for social change around gender issues in the Orthodox community with a focus on women's access to professional and lay leadership positions in synagogues, schools, and communal institutions, and women's inclusion in rituals in the home and in synagogues. We are very excited for today's webinar as it will address larger questions about how communities function, gender roles, relationships, and family structures. All of these serve as the important foundation for what roles women in particular are encouraged or permitted to play in the Jewish community. I'm confident that this webinar will give us some wonderful food for thought and some fascinating conversation for the Shabbat table. Please note that the panelists will be answering questions from the audience at the conclusion of the webinar. So please feel free to use the questions feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions throughout the webinar, and the panelists will address them at the end. And with that, I'd like to introduce Amy Powell, Director of Communications at HBI, and she will get us started.
Hi, thank you very much, Rachel. I'd just like to say a few words about the HBI. Our mission is fresh ways of thinking about Jews and gender worldwide by producing and promoting scholarly research, artistic projects, and public engagement. To that end, we are thrilled to recently publish in the HBI series on Jewish women, Love, Marriage, and Jewish Families, Paradoxes of a Social Revolution, edited and written by our very own co-director, Sylvia Barack Fishman. Sylvia is the Joseph and Esther Foster Professor of Contemporary Jewish Life and also co-director of HBI. She's the author of 8 books and numerous articles on the interplay of American and Jewish values, Jewish families, intermarriage, contemporary Jewish literature and film, and young American Jewish leaders and their attitudes toward Israel and Jewish peoplehood. This is her most recent book, and in 2014, Professor Fishman received the Marshall Sklar Award from the Association of Social Scientific Study of Jewry. We also are thrilled to have Michelle Shain, who is an associate research scientist at the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies here at Brandeis. She recently got her PhD in social policy from the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis. Her research focuses on fertility and family formation among American Jews, particularly on the dynamics of religiosity and social class, and she also works on the ongoing evaluation of Birthright Israel. Shain has published in numerous venues, including many academic journals, and written a chapter in this book. So I think we will start. Sylvia, Love, Marriage, Jewish Families, Paradoxes of a Social Revolution. This implies that the Jewish family is not what it once was. Can you tell us what this book is about?
Sure. This book, as the title says, is about changes in personal life, changes in attitudes and behavior around love, sex, marriage, and family formation. We see these things all around us. Our children are living through them. The chapters in the book are half written by Israeli scholars and half written by American scholars. One of the interesting things that we can do is to compare the way in which young Israeli adults and young American Jewish adults are behaving. And one of the things from both sides that the book does is bring us the voices of young American Jews and young Israeli Jews. I'm just going to talk about 3 big changes that we see regarding love, marriage, and Jewish families, especially in America, and we'll get a chance to talk more about each. First, only half of American Jews ages 25 to 54 are married right now. And this is even though most Americans want to get married and most American Jews want to get married. If we look at the younger segment of that group, only we have 3/4 of American Jewish men and 43% of American Jewish women ages 25 to 34 are not married. So that's a big change from the past. Second big change is a decline in Jewish fertility. Fewer American Jewish homes have children, and only 1/3 of non-Haredi American Jewish families, two-parent families, have school-aged children at home. We're going to talk more about that in a few minutes also. The third big change is that the nature of the Jewish families with children that do exist are different than they were. One difference is that most of them have two parents working outside the home for pay. That's a big change. The second one is that more of them are intermarried. More American Jews are married to non-Jews. 44% of married American Jews have a non-Jewish spouse. And that intermarriage rate is almost 60% among Jews who have married since 2000. We have more LGBTQ Jewish families, more lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transsexual Jews are married or partnered and are raising children. Another visible rate is changes that there are more Jews of color, both because we're more aware of Jewish families of color and also because increasing rates of transracial adoption mean that Jewish institutions have more of a rainbow hue than they used to have. So these are just a few of the many changes, and they've created both intended and unintended consequences.
Michelle, what are some of the basic facts about Jewish fertility rates? We heard an overview from Sylvia in the U.S.
Sure, so let's start actually with some basic facts about general fertility patterns in the U.S. In the last 40 years, let's say since 1970, we've seen really dramatic changes in fertility among American women. The first big change is a really large increase in age at first birth, the age at which women have their first child. The second is a really large increase in rates of childlessness, so the proportion of women who exit their childbearing years never having had a birth. And the third big change is a remarkable increase in rates of non-marital childbearing. In 2014, 40% of births in the United States were to women who were not married. And the really interesting thing about all of these changes is that they're not evenly distributed across the population. They're very strongly related to both social class and race. So the phenomena of delayed marriage and childbearing and of increased childlessness is really concentrated among white college-educated women. And the phenomenon of increased non-marital childbearing, although you see it across the population, is particularly prevalent among Black women and women with lower educational attainment. So let's think about American Jews for a moment. American Jews are very highly educated, and about 90% of American Jews identify as non-Hispanic white. So right there you can see that the fertility patterns and changes that we see among American Jews are going to be related to delayed marriage and delayed fertility and childlessness. The Pew Research Center's 2013 survey of U.S. Jews said that the completed fertility of 40 to 59-year-old American Jews, so here you're talking about younger boomers and older Gen Xers, was 1.9, which is below the fertility rate of the general public and below replacement level. Another study that was using data from the General Social Survey put the total fertility rate of American Jewish women at 1.4, which is lower than all other major religious and ethnic groups that they were looking at, including liberal white Protestants. And for the Jewish community, these low levels of fertility are cause for concern. First and foremost, because of the downward pressure that they exert on the population and population growth. But second, because of distancing from Jewish norms around raising children, and also because having children is strongly associated with engagement in Jewish life. So when you have a larger proportion of families, like Sylvia was saying, who don't have young children in the home and don't have school-age children in the home, you also see lower levels of participation in Jewish communal institutions. I think the other thing that I would say is that, American Jews are not a homogenous group. And part of my dissertation research was trying to look at differences within the population and to model the fertility of Jewish women who are currently of childbearing age, so currently between the ages of, let's say, 18 and 44. And what I found was that Orthodox women without a college degree, so this would be, for the most part, the Hasidic and Yeshivish population, reached replacement rate by 25, and by age 40, more than 4 births, something like 4.3. Then you have Orthodox women who do have a college degree. That's the preponderance of the modern Orthodox population, who reach replacement rate later, but still by 32, and by 40 are still averaging 3.5 births per woman. And then you have the non-Orthodox population, which is the bulk of the population, close to 90%. And among non-Orthodox women with a college degree, they actually never reach replacement rate, averaging about 1.5 births by age 40. I also want to note that the level of religious belief and practice of Jewish Americans is not related to fertility among the non-Orthodox, right? So when I looked within that population, what I was seeing was, regardless of engagement in Jewish life, the same fertility patterns were prevalent. So we're kind of looking at two distinct realities here, right? We're looking at a large majority of the population operating under these sort of general norms of upper middle class Americans, this idea that independence and self-actualization should precede marriage and childbearing. And then you have a smaller minority operating under more traditional and religious norms that really prioritize marriage and childbearing.
Yeah, if I can just jump
Sure.
in. There is a way in which you see a very strong correlation between fertility and Jewish connections. And that's if you look not at the question, are there any children, but if you look at the question, are you raising Jewish children? Now, in sociological research, we don't define for anybody what that means, raising Jewish children. So, of course, this is purely what the person being asked the question thinks it means. But that having been said, there's a very, very high correlation between people who say that they are raising Jewish children and all measures of Jewish involvement, which means that when we look at lower fertility, we're looking at a situation which doesn't just affect the future, it affects the current American Jewish young adult population. The people who are raising children who are Jewish by religion are more connected in anything you could measure, even Jewish internet usage or going to Jewish movies, are more connected than people who have no children, or people who are raising non-Jewish children, or people who are raising children who are Jewish but not by religion, however they define that. So we're really thinking about all of these marriage changes as having a profound effect on Jewish life today, not just producing the next generation of American Jews.
So how does it compare to what's happening in Israel?
Yes, so this is also a very interesting comparison. We can compare current fertility patterns to fertility patterns a few decades ago in the 1950s and early 60s. We can also compare them to what's going on in Israel. And Israel's an interesting point of comparison, not just because there are a lot of Jews there, so it's easy to make the comparison, but also because it's a developed country with most people getting high levels of what we would call secular education. And what we find in Israel is that non-religious Jews, Chiloni Jews, when they are asked the question, how many children should people like you have, say that people like them should have between 3 and 4 children. And actually, they're having about 3 children for the irreligious or the non-religious Jews. The average for Israel in general is 3.6. For both of them, that's the highest fertility rate in the developed world. And in comparison, if we look at Jews in New York, the fertility rate for modern Orthodox Jews in New York in 2011 was 2.5 children. So a modern Orthodox Jew in New York is on average having fewer children than a Chiloni and irreligious Jew in Israel. This is because Israel has what we would call a pro-natalist culture. Having babies is really, really important. Their lives are as complicated as the lives of American Jews, for sure. They spend time in the army, and then they first have to go to university, and they have to establish their jobs. But having babies is a big priority to them. And they're not so worried about having it all or doing it all. They just kind of do it. Whereas in America, there's an enormous emphasis on self-actualization. There's also a glamorization of childlessness and being free and having lots of choices. We could think of this book by Kate Bolick called Spinster, and on the cover of this book was an absolutely ravishing blonde person. And what it makes it look like is if you postpone these things, you're going to be young and gorgeous forever. So the difference between the pro-natalist society of Israel and the kind of anti-natalist society in the United States, one of the ways in which we see the effect is in these fertility levels.
Before we move on, can one of you maybe speak to the replacement rate? What exactly you mean by that, and what number are you looking for?
So in a developed country with very low levels of early death for infants, like the United States, replacement rate is 2.1 children per woman.
So what is the big picture here, Sylvia? What has led us to this point, and what does it mean going forward for Jewish family life?
So I alluded to some of the things that have made it. Obviously, there are economic realities that play a huge role in everybody's life. And there are political realities. Things aren't just ideological. But I think it's really important for us to recognize the extent to which when people make personal choices, they're very influenced by two circles. One is the inner circle of close friends and peers, and what they think is important, what they value. And the other is the broader circle of the larger culture. What has happened to the broader circle of the larger culture is that a lot of ideas which were considered very radical when they first began to be circulated in the 1970s and 1980s have now become mainstreamed. We've internalized a lot of these attitudes. I heard them doing interviews and the qualitative research that I do. So when I'm talking to a young-ish, in his 30s, Jewishly well-educated, Jewishly involved young man, and he said, well, I didn't want to get married before I was in my mid-30s because I don't want to get locked in too soon. Now that language of locked in, as though finding your soulmate is getting locked in, he doesn't hear the echoes of Philip Wiley and Erik Erikson and all those who ideologues and public intellectuals who were discouraging involvements, but those things have been mainstream. I'd say the same thing for women, although I don't want to indicate that men and women approach marriage and childbirth the same way. They sure don't. But women also have internalized and mainstreamed a lot of anti-family and of a fearfulness about having marriage and children. And I think that there's a lot of publicity today about the dangers of trying to do it all, trying to have it all. And there's a lot of non-publicity, kind of a silence about the fact that you actually do have a large segment of the well-educated population where both men and women are doing it all. But people, they just readjust what all means. But there's not a lot of publicity about that.
So where does it lead us? Where does it lead the community?
So where it leads the community is to, as Michelle mentioned before, kind of two different patterns. You do have a very exciting, I think, interesting model, which could actually be adopted by many more people than have adopted it, and that is a model of a family that I'm calling a partnership marriage, or you could call it a two-enabler family. And what that is you have both husband and wife in the case of a heterosexual couple, or both partners in the case of a homosexual couple, where they're both working outside the home for pay, and they're raising children. And what research shows us about these families in the United States is that these are very, very durable unions. Actually, the divorce rate in those kinds of families is extraordinarily low, which was not true 20 years ago. And I think that the difference between now and 20 years ago is that now young people enter these marriages knowing they're going to be negotiating. They're going to be thinking about who's going to do this. They're going to take things on a day-by-day basis. And that knowledge that they will be negotiating makes them extremely flexible. So when life throws something at them that they weren't expecting, they're already in the mode of trying to figure out how to do that. And Jewish families with children who are not Haredi, who are not the Hasidic and Yeshivish group that Michelle mentioned before, non-Haredi American Jewish families, starting with modern Orthodox and going all the way over to unaffiliated, are almost universally these two-career families, and so they share a lot of these very positive attributes that we find in these families.
Michelle, there's a lot of people who seem to want to get married in the cohort, and yet they're not. They're just not, and they're not starting. So what are some of the roadblocks that keep them from getting married, and then also that keep them from forming a family once they do?
Right, so there are actually 2 chapters in the book that are based on interviews with a cohort of 25 to 40-year-old Jewish young adults. One is my chapter. I was focused primarily on fertility, and the other is Daniel Parmer's chapter, and he was looking at marriage. And what we both heard almost universally from the Jewish young adults that we interviewed was, I want to get married, I want to have children, usually I want to have 2 children, right? But in terms of roadblocks, what was interesting is that vision existed in this very kind of vague and fuzzy future, and they didn't have any sort of concrete roadmap to getting there. They didn't really even speak to their significant others before they got married, even at the point when they're engaged or very early in their marriage, about when these children would come and how they would fit into their lives, which was a really stark contrast to the way that these young adults talked about their educational and career plans, right, where they had very clear goals, 1-year plans, 5-year plans, 10-year plans, internships, and ways to progress. So that's one roadblock, is the kind of lack of concrete thought about this issue. Another one, and Sylvia just alluded to this, is this fear, this palpable fear of the financial strain, the logistical strain, the emotional strain of child rearing. I had childless couples who I spoke to who talked about, and I would go to the grocery store after work, and it would be 6:30, and I would be seeing this mother screaming at her toddler, and I'd be thinking to myself, well, that just doesn't look like any fun. I don't know if I even want to do this at all. And they talked about, lack of intimacy in their own relationships and all of those strains and pressures that come with particularly young children. And I think what was really interesting there was that, some of the fear was driven by their very, very high expectations of themselves as parents, right? And that's typical of upper middle class individuals in general, but not just the baby should have a place to sleep and something to eat, but we should buy a house in a nice neighborhood with a good school system, and, we need to be able to provide, not just a reasonable education through 12th grade, but money for college and to pay for a wedding, right? So they have these extraordinarily high expectations of what they can give their children financially and in terms of their own time. And I think the third thing was just a general lack of social support. People talked about conversations about these kinds of private choices being really socially prescribed, right? Particularly with colleagues, but even with friends. Someone said to me, when you're talking about fertility, you're really talking about your sex life, and nobody wants to hear that, right? But just this idea that they couldn't ask anybody like, I'm in grad school and I want to work, but I want to have a baby, and when should I do that, right? But they didn't have anyone to speak to.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it was a lack of social support for meeting the basic demands of workplace and family, so high quality childcare, breastfeeding accommodation at work, that kind of thing. And some of it, and this is mostly what I heard from women, was that they didn't have role models for being able to combine career and family. Most of them said that their moms didn't work full time when they were young, right? So even though they learned as kind of children of the 80s, free to be you and me, that they should be able to combine career and family, they'd never seen anybody do it. And sometimes they would recall their moms actually being catty about women who did work full time. So, both from their own parents, from their friends, kind of from society in general, in the workplace, they didn't feel that support.
Yeah. And it's, I think that's one of the reasons that you see actually more of this model in the modern Orthodox community, because each one of the things that Michelle commented on are things that you see almost the obverse in the modern Orthodox community. So if we think about social support, these are people who can see other women doing the same thing who are 8 years older than them, 15 years older than them, and I think that helps a lot. There's also a lot of, almost one could say, incessant conversation about these issues, which provides its own kind of social support. And the third thing, which I think is also significant, is that modern Orthodox Jews, like evangelical Christians, like religious Muslims, like practicing Catholics, are used to being countercultural. So they can resist the anti-natalist pressure in the outside culture because within their own culture they have both practical examples, social support, and ideological kind of motivation to go against the prevailing liberal anti-natalism.
So, Sylvia, you spoke just a little bit about how people are managing their lives by dividing things, or that both parents are working. So I guess I would ask, how are they dividing things up? How have gender roles changed? And also, who's in charge of the Judaism? And if that is an added pressure, because if you feel like you have to cook a giant meal and host a million guests, does that make all this harder?
So I would say it makes it harder and easier. To start with your third question, Rachel Bernstein, who works with Michelle and who's finishing her doctoral dissertation at Brandeis University, made a very, very interesting discovery, which is we've all heard about the first shift of work and the second shift of family life. Well, turns out Judaism is a third shift, and somebody's got to do all of that work. And not surprisingly, the same kinds of pressures that often end up with women carrying more of their load in the second shift end up with women carrying more of their load in the third shift. That having been said, these partnership marriages or two-enabler marriages, the goal is always to create some kind of an equitable distribution. And a very interesting study of marital satisfaction was done, which showed that women actually were happier if the husband thought he was doing at least his portion. It's very, very interesting that the happiness of the mothers was not actually directly related to how many loads of laundry he really did, but it was more related to, did he think he was doing an equal amount? And my hypothesis as to why that's true is that if your life partner is somebody who is who has a goal of doing their part, that psychologically that makes a huge difference in the marriage. There's a huge range. There's also a lot of buying out of this problem. Hiring people who will do most of the housework, for example, especially when we're talking about the kind of upper middle class populations that Michelle has been alluding to. I think another thing which has happened is that gender roles have been really transformed. The idea of what a man is, what a woman is, has been transformed not only by the things internal to what we've been talking about, but to the prevalence of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, queer Jews within the community. The fact that the most connected of them are very interested in creating families and having children. So there are other models out there which weren't out. We also have the other model of single mothers by choice, which is women in their late 30s or early 40s who are having children without husbands and who are somehow managing, and whose children are actually embraced by the Jewish community. So the kind of rigid binary of daddy does this and mommy does that is challenged not just by what's going on inside of individual family units, but these broader changes in the family and the outside culture.
I think there's also another person who is taking up some of that third shift of Judaism work in the house, and that's grandma. When we did at the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies here at Brandeis a large study of millennial children of intermarriage and a comparison group of children of in-marriage, one of the things that was most striking was the strong correlation between the amount of contact they had with their Jewish grandparents and the strength of their Jewish connections in the kind of college and post-college years. And in our longitudinal study of applicants to birthright in the early years who now are old enough to have their own children, we also see large percentages, 20, 25, 30, 35%, who say that one of their parents is the primary child care provider for their child at least 1 or 2 days a week. So Jewish grandparents have kind of come into that void as well to take up some of the work of that Jewish education and family holiday celebrations and such.
What do people expect then with regard to, do they, you had said before they don't plan it that well. So then when it happens, do they have an expectation, or do they have an expectation ahead of it for what they'll each do or how they'll divide things, or who's responsible for?
They overwhelmingly reject, in principle, a traditional gender division of labor in their houses. And men talk about wanting to be active and involved fathers. And it was actually remarkable how many of the couples I interviewed said that they had at least discussed, if not tried, having the male partner stay home for some portion of the time or reduce his working hours. And I had men who were, I remember one guy was irate that when his child was born and he was in the hospital with his wife, that there was a new mothering group class support thing for moms, and there was no new fathering group support class thing for fathers. So they do expect to take on that role. Women almost universally expect to be able to combine career and motherhood. But again, they don't have a lot of successful models for that. And so when they run into the mommy penalty at work in terms of career advancement and all of these other issues, childcare was a big one. And then the men, I had one guy said to me, until my child was born, I'd never held a baby. Right? So they weren't socialized to be the babysitter. They weren't the person who was called on to take that role. So when reality hits, they're a little bit afloat.
It's the second generation of smaller families. That's what you're seeing, because in larger families, you don't have to give birth to a child to hold it. It could be your younger sibling.
Right.
And the fact that Harriet Hartman points this out, that we're talking as though this is like a sudden thing that has happened, but this has actually been building up. The other thing that she points out was interesting is that there's actually not such a mommy penalty for Jewish women so far, that Jewish women actually have much less now of what we call a marriage penalty or a child penalty, and they seem to get ahead at work almost as fast as men do, which is a change, yes, as well.
Michelle, how do people get information today? Like if they feel, how do they if they're having trouble, oh, how do I hold a baby? Or, you know, how should I figure this out? You said they don't have role models. So, like, what do they do then?
Yeah, first up, Google.
First up is Google.
I don't think I did a single interview where the internet didn't come up at all. Young
so people
Jewish
Google,
adults,
how should I hold this baby?
Yeah, well, they use the internet. I mean, first of all, they use the internet to meet and screen potential partners. Online dating sites are a huge source of meeting partners. They use the internet as a resource. Couples dealing with infertility, couples looking for advice about timing childbearing to minimize disruption to their careers will go to blogs. You know, also learning about Judaism. You know, I need to put up a mezuzah. Google, how do you put up a mezuzah? You'll get the answer, right? That was first stop for almost every question. And they actually expressed a desire for more and better online resources.
Wow.
Right, so it wasn't that they were saying, wow, I wish I had a person to talk to instead of having to Google this. It was like, why aren't the websites better?
So why don't they call mom or dad or a friend? And does that ultimately, not having those kinds of conversations with actual people, does that lead to, you know, some sort of issue down the road of isolationism or loneliness or lack of connection between the generations?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer. I can tell you that interviewees didn't see their internet use as the cause of their lack of social support. They saw it as a response to it.
As a response.
Yeah.
So I think this would be a good time to take some questions. We have quite a few. Thank you, everybody, for asking them. So one viewer is asking if communal pressure to have lots of kids backfires and makes people want to wait longer to have them.
Oh, yes. And let me issue a group disclaimer here. We are talking about people who actually want to get married or partnered when we talk about marriage. We are talking about people who want to have children when we talk about having children. We are not talking about people who do not want to get married and partnered. We are not talking about people who don't want to have kids. No one should ever have a child that they don't want. Here's what we're talking about. We're talking about people who really deeply want to have children, but as Michelle so vividly described, when it comes to their careers, they talk to people, they plan it out. They know what they're going to do when they want to get their first job and how they're going to get ahead at their first job. And they've got it all down in a plan. It doesn't always work out that way because that's life, but they've got a plan. When it comes to their personal decisions, finding somebody you want to spend their life with, having children, when to have them, how far apart to have them, how to take care of them, all of these personal issues, as Michelle said, it's very, very vague. So when we talk about these things, we're saying you can plan for your personal life the same way you plan for your professional life. And just like in your professional life, things may not work out the way, but at least knowing what you want helps so much. Books that deal with how people accomplish their goals always make the point that if you know deeply what you want and you plan for it, even if the plan goes somewhat differently than what you want, it does make a difference in your being able to achieve those goals. So no, the Jewish community should never, never pressure people to have children and lots of them, but the Jewish community, and we'll probably talk about this later, certainly should do something to help those people who would like to have them.
So that actually is a great lead into the next question, which is, given that more Jews are not having kids, do you have any suggestions to Jewish institutions and synagogues about how to do a better job engaging these types of families?
Sure. Well, so let's look at programs and initiatives that we know have been successful in engaging Jewish young adults and in putting them on more of the Jewish path. Jewish summer camps, Israel experiences, both high school Israel experiences and college, post-college trips like Birthright Israel and Honeymoon Israel, which is a newer initiative. What those experiences have in common is that they are peer-based, and that there's this very strong sort of social element. There's a very strong Judaism as a lived experience kind of element. So I think that, and also when you interview Jewish young adults about, hey, why don't you do Jewish stuff? A lot of times they'll say, I don't have anybody to go with. I don't have anybody to go with. Nobody wants to walk into a room where they don't know anybody. So I think that, engaging groups of friends, cohorts of individuals who live in the same place, who can be a resource for each other and be the person that you go into the room with is really, really key. So really thinking about social networking in terms of planning, I think would be one area.
Thank you. This next question deals with the Judaism shift we spoke about. How do you think the third shift divided into Jewish content and housework pieces like cooking, cleaning, hosting for Seder's, Shabbat meals? Are women also putting themselves in charge of the Jewish content, or is that still primarily the men?
So I think women, this is a place where we really see a lot of gender fluidity. Women very much take it on themselves to deal with the spiritual and intellectual aspects of Judaism now. I don't at all see that that is something that's relegated to men. I would say in the non-Orthodox world, if anything, it's primarily women who are doing it. If we look at the Reform community, 2/3 to 3/4 of adult Jewish learners are male, not female. So certainly there, but in the Orthodox community as well, because women today tend to have very high levels of Jewish education, they're very involved in the spiritual elements. And the obverse is also true, which is, again, because of gender fluidity. Now that there are all of these programs on television like Chopped and the Chopped variations, men are used to being in the kitchen. Men are happy. So you have much more of when you have a Shabbat invitation, you don't know who actually made that brisket or that tofu brisket, whichever it is that you see. And I think this is one of the reasons that we have this kind of resilience and vibrancy in these two enabler families is because of the gender fluidity, so that people tend to gravitate towards what they're good at and what they're interested in rather than some predetermined gender division of labor. So because of some of the things you said about intermarriage, we have a question here about that. Do you think that intermarriage rates would decrease if it was easier to convert? Or should it be easier to convert? Okay, so in some wings of Judaism, it's actually quite easy to convert. What we see in studying the rates of intermarriage and the rates of conversion is that rates of conversion have actually not risen along with rates of intermarriage. We have many, many fewer people converting today than in the past. When you talk to them about why they're not converting, they actually don't talk about difficulty of conversion. What they talk about is, if they're Jewishly involved, they'll say, I'm already living Jewishly. I don't feel the need to formally convert. I already feel like I'm raising my children as Jews. I feel like I'm part of the Jewish people. And there's a kind of broader cultural discomfort now with the idea of converting, because it seems like one is giving up some aspect of one's essential self. I would say that those things have much more to do with the lower rates of conversion than perceived difficulties in conversion.
So in that kind of a house, though, does it even matter if the person converts or not? Do you think?
Well, it depends on which environment they live in, and then also what their children's goals will eventually be.
Do you think more people would have children if paid parental leave was common in the U.S.? And what effect do you think that sort of law would have in the New York area in the next 10 years?
That's a really good question. When you look at studies that compare countries, and they look at sort of levels of egalitarianism, gender egalitarianism within those countries, right? And they do this, looking at paid parental leave and availability and affordability of childcare and all kinds of other measures. What you find is that fertility rates are higher in countries where there is more social support and less of a penalty for women for having children. At the same time, though, when you look at countries that have tried to kind of put a specific initiative in place with the direct goal of raising fertility rates. So here I'm talking about places like Japan, Germany, South Korea, with very low fertility rates that kind of threaten the economic structure of the country. Australia did this baby bonus where they gave people $5,000 if they had a baby. Those programs pretty much universally don't do anything to raise fertility rates overall, and occasionally they'll push the tempo of fertility forward, right? So people who are going to have a baby anyway maybe have that baby a little bit earlier, right? So you kind of have these two strands of research. On the one hand, that these specific targeted initiatives tend not to do anything, but on the other hand, that creating an entire climate that is family friendly does have a major impact.
Yeah. Actually, Sergio Della Pergola did some really interesting research on Israelis about these issues. And what he found was that the availability of the kind of childcare that they needed would have made a big difference to them. And I think that a lot of the research that's done in America also shows that men are often worried about money. Women are often worried about not having enough personal time in terms of having children, but everybody is worried about not just is the childcare going to be paid, but is it going to be available? I would say that that's even more important than the expense of childcare, that anyone who has gone through it can talk about what a hassle it often becomes and how terrifying it often is to deal with not great options.
Right.
So people do talk about that, and the indications are that, as Michelle said, changing the climate, not paying people per baby, but changing the climate so that the climate is actually supportive to having children does make a big difference.
Because paid parental leave, I think, wouldn't actually solve
You'd have
the
to first
child care problem.
Right.
That's like a whole separate thing that has to be in place.
Right.
So you had mentioned things that sort of help, like camp and day school and birthright and trips to Israel. And then fast forward, people go on these things and they have these Jewish communities, and then they don't have them anymore. If they're saying, well, who will I go with? Who will I go with? So is there, what should we do about that? Should we have to, is there a way to keep those communities alive, the ones that people identified with? Is there a way to?
It's not always possible to keep your birthright bus
That's true.
as a coherent unit. However, I think one of the clear policy implications for the American Jewish community is to create opportunities for social interactions for young adults, starting immediately post-college and stretching into the now extended young single adult years. It's not just important for people who want to find a partner or a lifetime mate. It's important for exactly the reasons that Michelle mentioned. Social networks, people need to have flesh and blood friends, and there aren't so many opportunities. Once you're finished with college, graduate, or professional training, and you're out there in the world, it's not so easy to find a Jewish social circle. And that's something the Jewish community really needs to think about. Moishe houses are a great example of something which was invented and which is working. But we need more creative, interesting ideas like that.
It's particularly true because Jewish young adults are a highly mobile population. They tend to move toward magnet cities with high levels of kind of economic opportunity. So in those cities in particular, it's really important to think about creating social opportunities, but not just social opportunities for Jews that sound like meat markets. People hate that, right? Social opportunities that are built around a shared interest or a shared task, right? and actually Israel stuff tends to be a good kind of magnet, right? But music, the arts, theater, challah, baking, dance, an interesting speaker, politics, like something that unites this group of people besides the fact that they're Jewish and, you know, they know that mommy wants them to have Jewish friends.
Mm-hmm. So thank you very much. I think this would be a good time to sort of take a few minutes to wrap up what we've learned. Michelle?
Sure. So I suppose in terms of takeaways, I think as a researcher, I always want to end with more research is needed. But I do think that it would be valuable if we could do very kind of detailed qualitative study of both the modern Orthodox community, but also other communities around the United States that are bucking the trend of delayed marriage and delayed fertility and creating these sort of countercultural spaces that are supportive to young families. American Mormons is one example, and see how those countercultural norms are being communicated and whether that can be translated into non-Orthodox Jewish settings. And I suspect that, you know, part of what we would find if we did that is that in non-Orthodox Jewish settings, there's a fear of speaking to these private issues, and particularly speaking about these issues to children and teenagers and encouraging them to think so far in the future. And I wonder what would happen if we opened that conversation from the pulpit and within our schools, particularly religious schools where the bulk of American Jews still get their education. The second thing, you know, when we had the question about paid parental leave in New York triggered this for me, is that, you know, we have but we have had Jewish issues on which we lobby as a community, right? The state of Israel is the most obvious one, also the exodus of Soviet Jewry from the Soviet Union. Is family policy a Jewish issue in that way? And should we be involved in issues about not only paid family leave, but the quality and training of the early child care workforce and all of these other things? And the third thing that I would say kind of as a caveat to the previous one is that family-friendly policies start at home, and Jewish organizations could be, should be, but really aren't now, models of family-friendly workplace culture. So I think that's something also that we could think about kind of following on this conversation.
So where I would start is also with conversations. And one of the things that those of us who work on research on the changing family discover very quickly is that there's an enormous discomfort in dealing with these issues in the Jewish institutional community. They feel like this is personal. We shouldn't go there. We're going to offend women. We shouldn't talk about it. But I think we need to recognize that Jewish families are the basis of the Jewish connections of today's Jews and tomorrow's Jews. We really need to talk about how to create environments which are more supportive. They are key. Raising Jewish children is key to today's Jewishness and tomorrow's Jewishness. I think that these families actually provide us with kind of astonishing role models, both in the United States and in Israel. And it's very interesting that this dual enabler family is also a very, very prevalent model in Israel. So there are specific policies that communities can do, I think, to make a difference. First, they should emphasize Jewish educational opportunities that extend through the teen years when people are at home. And I'm going to emphasize this teen years. We saw when we looked at the Pew data that there's actually a direct correlation between are you in some kind of formal Jewish schooling when you're a teenager after bar mitzvah, and do you get married at all? It's very interesting. That something about the group interaction makes marriage more important. And I don't think the American Jewish community has really internalized the importance of post-bar bat mitzvah Jewish educational opportunities in summer camps, but not just in summer camps, during the year. Second, I think we need to create, as I said before, a broad spectrum of creative, accessible programs for post-college adults, all kinds of programs. As Michelle said so eloquently, they need to be organized around issues or activities so that they don't feel like a meat market, but we need to have them all over the place. And third, I think we need to create Jewish programming for the families that do exist, going all the way from young, connected families, who after all are not chopped liver, they need programming to, all the way to very unconnected families. So I think that's a three-pronged approach where we could actually make a difference. Things will happen, not just because they're happening, but also what is our response to what's happening. And both our present and our future depend on how we respond today.
So, do you think that because the youth group question, I just wanted to come back to that for a little bit. When you're in a youth group and you're active, you know, then you're meeting people all over the place and you have just more friends and more friends in more places. Does that then help you later, Michelle? You know, when you say, oh, I don't have anyone to do this with, like, wherever you land, might you then know someone, you know? Or,
There's definitely a correlation between participation in Jewish youth groups in high school, BBYO, USY, these kinds of groups, and being active in Jewish life in the college and post-college years. I don't think that we know exactly what the mechanism there is, but I think it's a good hypothesis that it's really a social network effect, right? That because you have more Jewish friends, then the things that your friends are doing are more likely to be Jewish, and you'll go with them, right?
What it seems to be is that people replicate in college the kind of friendship, the nature of the friendship circle, not the exact friendship circle, but the nature of the friendship circle that they had in high school. So that those teen years, people are actually setting up patterns of how they respond to things. And those patterns, not the people necessarily, but those patterns are portable to later stages of life.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank both of you for participating and thank our audience for so many terrific questions. And thank JOFA for inviting us to partner with them.